Our next speakers come from BFI, and they will talk about that eternal question of theory and practical training and how that embeds together. So, without any further ado, this is Charles and Thom from BFI.
Thank you, Miroslav. Thank you, everybody, for coming along to hear this. Just a little bit about myself. I am Charles Fairall. I work for the British Film Institute and started sort of 40 years ago and made the first recording for what is now the National Television Archive in the UK. And so I started out as a videotape engineer, fixing the machines, installing machines, maintaining machines, doing everything you have to do to make sure that recordings would work in the future. And at that time, we kind of didn't know about digital, so we made recordings that we thought possibly might have to be migrated to another videotape format in 20 years' time, just as maybe it happened before, from 2-inch to 1-inch. Maybe we'd go from 1-inch to some other inch. So that's where I started, and I have an admission that I want to share with the room today, and that is that I'm still a videotape engineer, and that it can be quite lonely sometimes, being a videotape engineer. But the enormous pleasure I get from standing in such august surroundings is made even more special for me today, because at last I have somebody to bring up on stage with me who shares the passion and love and fascination for all things to do with videotape. Now, we're not really talking about video here, we're talking about videotape. Now, videotape also has audio on it, incidentally, so azimuths and things like that that we talk about for audio also apply. So without further ado, I'd love to welcome Thom Walker, who is a trainee, one of our first ever trainee in a formal capacity, who has joined the BFI under a scheme which he will now explain much better than I can, because he's actually been doing it.
Thank you, Charles. And it feels very, very strange to basically be here telling you about like my first week at school. It's a very odd feeling, but it's something that's been mentioned a few times today already about this issue in the industry about a skills pipeline. I know from my time at the BFI, short as it is, there was a pipeline there through BBC, ITV for videotape engineers. We're now coming to a point where that pipeline's not really present anymore, and so the BFI were very fortunate to get some money from the Heritage Innovation Fund, it's a lottery fund, to explore ways that they could try and develop that workforce for the future without those pipelines in place. And I'm very fortunate to be one of the trainees on that role. We've also had a couple of trainees in the film conservation team and a couple of film conservation trainees before that who have piloted the system and sort of gone into it there. One of the big sort of things that we've been exploring through this project is obviously the idea of innovation, and part of that being as well, without these pipelines, well, where are we looking for our skills? So, for example, my background is not a particularly technical one. It was an art background. I always kind of describe it as an art study that was very engaged with technology, definitely not an engineering study that was very engaged in art. So it's quite an important distinction. And we're very lucky to get some of Charles's time, because one of the first things I did when I walked into the space was, well, what do I need to know? How do I do this? And it turns out there's quite a lot. You do quite a lot in 40 years. Who would have thought it, And so, yeah, that's kind of a bit why we're here today. And this is sort of one way that the BFI is exploring that one particular issue. And I'm going to pass back to Charles to talk a bit about how he went about taking someone whose sole experience of videotape was that my grandparents had a copy of Disney's Aristocats on VHS, so we used to watch that every time. It was either that or train documentaries. So to go from there to wanting to help preserve and look after our collection. So I'll pass back to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, when he mentioned the Aristocats, I said, yeah, that'll do. Great, come in. So, I was very flattered to be asked, really, by Tom, because he wasn't specifically being attached to videotape. He was in the sort of archive technology groove, which videotape is kind of part of. But we got chatting about loads of other stuff before we talked about videotape, which is why I knew we were going to get on, because it's good to talk about videotape, but not all the time. So we have an interest in various bits of music and art, and and bits of philosophy, which he knows far more about than I do. And he knows the classics. I don't really know much about the classics, but I know a little more than I did because I met Tom. So I said to him, well, look, I'm not really going to be a professor. I'm not really a professor. I'm kind of a practitioner, really. I like to kind of, most of the time, be on my own, fixing stuff and making it work. Asking those eternal questions. Is it the tape, or is it the machine, or is it both? Because that's kind of what you have to do when the tapes don't work, is ask those questions, which is a bit prosaic, really. But I thought, well, if you want to kind of have a slice of what it's like to try and operate like people like me and others do, I thought, well, you really have to do a little bit of this. Most people run for the hills whenever you talk about any kind of maths or, algebra or science. They left that behind at school and ran for it. Unfortunately, or fortunately, actually, depending on how you look at it, if you're going to fix videotape machines and make tapes work and get good results, unless everything is in your favor, it ain't going to happen without some kind of understanding of how the thing works, and it's quite complex. So because I realized that Tom was always up for a conversation about something interesting, I said, well, look, why don't we had 12 days, one day a week for 12 weeks. Why don't we spend the mornings in a kind of tutorial sense, sit down and chat about stuff, technical stuff, principles. And it made, of course, you do that, then suddenly you've got to kind of go off and do some reading to make sure that it makes sense. So we broke it down into some very simple things, really, fundamental things that I sort of believe that I've got some idea about, got some handle on. There are loads and loads and loads of things that I don't. I'll be the first to admit that I'm not highly proficient in every area that you have to be to kind of get to the roots of problems. But I mean, I have tenacity and determination, and I like talking to people about things, so I get there. But just state facts and in a position where you can teach somebody is really quite challenging. But I said, well, I'll tell you what I know. I'll tell you what I know, and I'll tell you what I do, and then you can see if that works. So we did that, and I think we did like an hour and a half, 2 hours, sometimes and I would set you homework. I'd say, right, here's a YouTube video. Go and see what something to do with sine waves and AC theory and RMS values and stuff, which you kind of have to know about, and resonant frequencies. All of this stuff applies very, very directly with videotape recording. And I was amazed because Tom would go off and then come back with like 5 times more interesting things than I'd suggested, which was incredibly stimulating for me, actually. I have to say, it was to be able to spend that much time talking about stuff down in the weeds that other people, understandably, haven't got the time for, frankly. But anyway, that was a tremendously valuable part of it. And we, I don't want to go through the list here, but it's all stuff that kind of goes with the territory. It's stuff that engineers talk about all the time and make reference to, either very, very shallow or incredibly deep on occasions. You kind of dip in and out of all of this stuff all the time. But we had quite a lot of fun with that, I think. Well, maybe you can agree or disagree.
It was pretty much the only time I ever did my homework, so, it makes change. It was very hands-on learning, obviously. And so we sort of looked at some of the key parts that we would need to know to make these tapes play. We were specifically looking at the tapes that were already causing us difficulties. So just the key elements, how you service a machine, how you service the power supplies, how you kind of how you replace a head drum, what your issues are with the tape, looking inside the cassettes. We spent a lot of time actually looking at the different carriers and inside the cassettes and looking where our issues were. And it was very sort of hands-on. It was essentially whenever we got a ticket raised from our video conservators, we went and did that together. So it was very much a vocational learning. And sometimes it would be really good if you plugged your A to D in, and sometimes it was kind of a stuck tension arm or something like that where we could go in and have a look. I think that's probably the only way to be doing this kind of work, really, is to be hands-on and to be really looking at what it is you're doing and understanding the materiality. That was certainly how we wanted to sort of come to it. And we spent about 2 days at one point trying to get one pneumatic tape to play because it just wouldn't move. And every time we ran it, we got a little bit further and a little bit further and a little bit further. And then we had to stop and clean the machine, and then we ran it again, and it got a little bit further, et cetera, et cetera. And it sort of, you really got into the weeds, I think, is an excellent way of putting it for what that process is. Yeah. Oh, sorry, still me. And we were also sort of looking at, with that in mind, looking at the workflow and looking at understanding what it was that the conservators were doing and what it was that we needed to be doing sort of as technicians or as engineers or whatever to help them reach their goal of digitizing these tapes, especially the ones that are causing them problems. So Charles is going to give us a bit of a rundown of one specific project.
Thanks. Yeah, so for the most part, the collections within our organisation, the BFI, the videotape collections have been home created, so they've been recorded within the premises and stored in our vaults. And really, many of them not touched for decades until they were then brought out for digitisation. So a lot of effort went into making good recordings and looking after them. And actually, that takes a tremendous amount of load off the challenge. Because VTRs, when you're maintaining them for recording purposes, it's more than twice the work for when you're maintaining them for replay. Because recording is more critical than replay, because you have to make sure the tapes will interchange with other machines. Whereas if you're playing a tape, you just play the tape. So we have already digitized, well over 100,000 videotapes that haven't caused much trouble. That's not to say that there haven't been problems, because of course there have. There always are with machines. However, one particular collection that we are involved with, which times perfectly with the spell that I've had with Thom, as I was already looking into this, was a tape format called M2, which is a Panasonic competitor to Betacam SP, back from the Sony Betacam SP days. So it's almost the same machine, really, except it's completely different. And it was sold to a few people, and it worked very well. It was pretty experimental because Panasonic weren't really in the videotape business like Sony and Ampex were. So they were kind of developing this format as they were going. And we have a very large collection of M2 tapes, which are a television collection, because of course, bear in mind, the BFI is not just television, it's a heritage collection. But this is television, it's breakfast television from the earliest days of independent breakfast television. So it was groundbreaking stuff, contains amazing content, interviews with David Bowie and stuff. It's not trivial. This is a very important collection. However, unfortunately, it wasn't recorded within the BFI and it wasn't stored in BFI conditions. And it's been used. It's been used like a library. It's been used presumably for sales purposes. So let's get that interview off and then get the tape out and stick it back on the shelf. So you can see in that image at the top there on the left, the tape has formed a kind of square. That's where it's been stuck on the guides for 30 years and has taken on the shape of that. And that's why you shouldn't leave tapes mid-reel wound, because it'll never change its shape. I mean, we did talk about getting an iron out and giving it a quick iron, but it didn't seem like a good idea. So that's an example, mid-reel wound, going to take on, it's going to damage the tape basically. And when you play that tape, you'll see it because it's analog. You'll get an imperfection as it goes past that bit. Unfortunately, worse than that, if you look at the image on the right, you'll see little tiny spots, hopefully, on that reel there, that pack. They're hard to see, and you can see some other marks on these other photos here. The shot down on the bottom right is actually a little nick on the edge of the tape where a tear has started. So very often you'll find videotapes when you try and play them or clean them, they tear diagonally. Very, very common. It took me quite a while, and we worked on a project called Heritage 2022 where we digitised 100,000 tapes across the UK a few years ago. We said to the service providers, don't try and play tapes that look like they have mould, just send them to me. And I personally dealt with about 1,000 videotapes, many of which had this thing. And you can see there's a sort of white discoloration around the beginning of that nick, and that is a tiny spot of mould. And what happens is, in damp storage conditions, you end up with mould, deciding or not that it's going to have a feast on the tape. And if you leave the tape mid-reel wound, it'll go into where the program is. If you left the tape wound at the ends, it would still have an eat, but it would probably eat some colour bars, rather than potentially your David Bowie interview. So this is the kind of stuff we were dealing with, and unfortunately we're finding that many tapes were breaking, or had already broken in this collection. So it wasn't a case of trolley load of tapes, put it in the machines, off we go. It's a case of another one's broken, another one's broken. Stop, you can't work like that. And at that point, I said to Thom, well look, we're going to have to start dealing with videotape more like we deal with film. It's going to have to be an inspection process, careful remediation. And I'm afraid to say that, despite everything we would wish, it's not just the machines that are problems now. The machines are definitely a problem, but they're half the problem. The tapes are still randomly throwing problems at us, which can be catastrophic. So this is where we picked up on this format, and we've got a process ready to go. We need to move on with this project. It's in our business plan. We've got to digitise the collection. It's extremely high value, and there's a team of people waiting to move on with it. But we hadn't got a workflow that included the degree of conservation that we thought was required. So Thom and I looked at it together, and hopefully you can pick up from there, Thom, and explain what we do.
Absolutely. So Charles has very, very eloquently outlined what our problem was, and we kind of had two options, I suppose, which is don't play the tapes, yeah, all right, or do something about it. And so we thought we'd give that second one a try. And so what we did, a few little bits and pieces, we had a VHS cleaning machine that we were able to modify to be able to work on M2. Unfortunately, we still found it was just too rough. We couldn't put the tapes in. And we're very fortunate at the BFI. We've got a big sort of drive towards trying to look at how we do things and trying to bring stuff forwards. So you can see on the bottom there, we've got a number of 3D printers. I know earlier it was mentioned sort of 3D printing parts, which is something we're absolutely looking at doing. But we're also looking at, actually, are there places where we can make something that can be a sort of addition or an amendment to a workflow? Have we got anywhere where we can actually help our conservators out, just do their jobs easier? And so one of the things we were looking at, and I've got an early prototype in my hand here, which is a 3D printed model of an inspection jig for this M2 project, so specifically designed so that we can get those open, we can get a bit of movement on them. We were able to lift up the spools so that we're not running along the bottom of the cassette. It is for doing it open cassette, but it will sort of release the locks. It's an early prototype, and we've also sort of started talking about, well, how do we take this forward? Okay, what else do we need? We actually need a visual, because some of these spots of mold are small, really, really small. And if you're asking people to look at that for days on end, that's tough. So, okay, we need cameras. Okay, do we actually want to record these incidences? Can we look at then bringing that into the space where we're using OBR to see if we can detect these quicker, easier? We've got thousands of these tapes to do. And so that's kind of where we're looking at taking this forward, whether that's within the scope of of this project or whether that's a sort of long-term goal. But that's been a big part of our thinking is, right, what does, as training, we're training for now, but we're also training for 5 years' time. And that needs to be a part of what we're thinking all the time. And so we're looking to bring that into what we're doing. And this is sort of one way that we've been looking at doing that.
Thank you, Tom. And we have actually had our first hands-on sort of session with video conservators who are, for the first time, undoing cassette shells, taking screws out of cassette shells and looking inside them. Just to emphasize what you're saying there, the tapes are so fragile around those points where they break that you cannot motorize it at all. You have to use your fingers and have as little friction as possible to go towards where you see one of those dots, and then you have to pick underneath it. Otherwise, it just slices. You know how difficult it is to get sellotape or sticky tape to? Well, this is like the complete opposite of that. If only they'd make sellotape like that, but they don't. So hand operated. The camera idea we kind of hatched one evening when we were looking for toys to play with. And we found a camera based on an ESP32 microcomputer, which has AI Edge technology in it for £30, €30. So we bought one of those, and I said, well, let's see if we can stick that on at some point, because we might even be able to train it to look for mold. To reflect on this, from my point of view, absolute dream come true to have someone like Tom who comes with a sort of appreciation of the physicality of what we're dealing with. This is a physical thing. This is a physics experiment that videotape has been an experiment all the way along. We're still in that experiment. And to reflect really, we've spent 12 days together and we've achieved a phenomenal amount. Tom's confident to take VTRs apart safely, to look at electronic aspects, to look at mechanical aspects, to look very closely and to see where the challenges are, and then go away and come back with a 3D model of the solution the next day. This is astonishing. You know, this is 12 years worth of advancement in 12 days, I would say. So to reflect, we can do that. You don't need to have an engineering background. It helps if you have a bit of maths and a bit of physics and a bit of understanding of materials. But actually, it's really the passion and the kind of intent that matters.
Thank you. And just on a sort of final point, I guess I'd say, obviously, from my point of view, it's been remarkable to get to work with Charles, and you know, there's a lot of experience that I'm sure you've all probably heard about as well. And the one thing that I would say is that, you know, when I went into that space for the first time with our film engineers and our videotape engineers, I was the only person under 30 by quite a distance. And so just as something that people might want to be considering is there's also contextual knowledge that your staff have, and that once they go, not only the technical knowledge, there's so much contextual knowledge, there's so much hands-on learning. So if you do have the opportunity to sort of think about your workforce and think about what that workforce needs to look like in 5 years' time, there are lots of people just like me who are incredibly excited about the idea of being involved in this. So yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Charles. So we have another, let's say, minute for questions. I'm sure there are many. Maybe one. Nadia?
Hi, Charles. Thank you so much. This was very exciting, and I'm so happy that you're doing this job and that you're training young people, and this is absolutely great. I have a question. Did you verify that this is mold, the white spots? Because I discovered similar, and this is, to my understanding, this is, I discovered this with DAT tapes, which are tearing the same way in such a, like the head shape, head drum shape. And what I found out is there is always a tiny little a gluey point. And from my understanding, this is plasticizer exudation, crystallized plasticizer, and not necessarily mold.
In the case of these M2 tapes, I worked on about 600 of them in the Heritage 2022 project. And I took quite a lot of samples over to the University of Cranfield. And I worked with the professor of mycology. And I asked him the same question, because I wouldn't want to presume. And, you know, there's a sort of sense that says, well, it doesn't really matter what it is, because it's already happened and these things are damaged and you just got to get on with it. It is nice to know. He said it was mold in those examples. He was quite clear about that. I showed him other things where I said I didn't think it was mold, and some of them were and some of them weren't. I don't think it's fair to say that every piece of white speck that you see inside a videotape or on a videotape is mold. It can be to do with plasticizers, it can be to do with lubricants that are in videotapes. But in this situation, we're pretty confident it was mold. He said the good news is that it's dead. It's been dead for years. It's not going to come out and eat you. And that the hazard would be only likely be a sort of dust hazard for people with, like me, with respiratory sensitivities. But he was quite sure that it was mold in this situation, yes.
Okay.
But that's another presentation, isn't it, really?
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good.